Hey friends, if you're using Playwright for end-to-end testing or synthetic monitoring with Checkly, you might have heard that you should write your Playwright scripts in a user-first manner. That means you should click buttons or submit forms and then wait for the UI to reach a certain state rather than checking for implementation details. But sometimes you have to intercept and analyze the network layer to see if your UI is rendering properly and it's doing what it's supposed to. And this is what we'll cover in this video. Let's go! To show you how you can intercept the network layer, I built a quick example project. What we have here is a website that is running on my local host, and once you click this submit button, you will see that it starts polling this API endpoint that is at API submit, and the responses will include in progress, in progress, in progress, only to then eventually return success and a name, and this name then is rendered in the UI. This polling approach is very common for user interactions that kick off a longer computation on the API side, on the server side. For example, in the past, I worked at e-commerce stores where submitting an order could take 10, 15, 20 seconds, and then the front end had to continuously poll, waiting for the order ID to know that the order actually came through. So how could we write a Playwright test for this situation? Because we obviously have to check the network layer multiple times to figure out if the UI is rendering the correct results. When we head over to my editor, I already prepared a quick Playwright test case. We are here in a polling spec.ts file that includes one test case that is called assert a specific API response, and I already filled it with a little bit of life so that we don't have so much typing to do. What we'll do is we will use this helper function here, getFulfilledResponse, to implement network monitoring, and then we will click this button. Then we will use the promise that will be responded from our helper function. We will check the response body, and then we will log it out to see if we got the correct response. Remember, we are continuously polling all these requests, and we want to find the last one. And then we include a web-first assertion to check if the correct headline is visible, and we will extend this getRole heading with the name that is included in the last API response. When you look at the script, you already see that TypeScript isn't particularly happy about it, but also when I run this script right now, it won't work because our helper function getFulfilledResponse isn't implemented yet. And that's what we're gonna do here right now. To make this test case work, we have to do three things. We have to intercept the network layer, and then we have to wait for the correct request URLs. And for these requests with the correct URL, we have to check and parse the response. And then once we're happy and we think that this is the API response that includes success and a name property, then we have to return this response object. So that's the game plan. How could we get started? A quick way to wait for API responses in Playwright is to use the page waitForResponse method. So when we now bring this in, we can have a look at the docs. It returns a matched response, and we're looking for requests and responses that were made to an endpoint that includes API and submit. So when we now run this test again, this should already work. And let's have a look. TypeScript is already happy. But as you see here right now, this returned the first of our polling requests. It didn't return the last one. So when you use page waitForResponse, it will return the first matching response. And in our case, that is not what we want to do. Only watching out for request URLs won't cut it for us here right now because we want to intercept and read the response bodies too. And to do that, we have to change how we use waitForResponse. If we also want to consider the response bodies, we can pass in a function, and this function then can return either a Boolean value or a promise that resolves to a Boolean value. And if the result is truthy, this response will be the result of waitForResponse, and if it's false, it will just continue listening and checking for more responses. So the first step is to include a condition to filter out all these response URLs that we don't care about. And this is exactly what this condition does. So if the response doesn't include API submit, then we're returning false, which then instructs waitForResponse to continue listening for more responses to then find the right one, the success one that we're actually looking for. As a next step, we can now start working with this response object that we have provided in this callback function. And we see here that Copilot is already predicting the way. What we want to do is we want to check and get the response body by using the JSON function. And now we can return response body status equals success to get this Boolean value out of it. So if the response body status property, remember here we have success, is equal success with a capital S, then we want to return true so that this wait for response then returns this response that included success. Let's add a little bit of logging here so that we can make sure that this actually works. So we now expect that console log monitoring response will be called multiple times until we found this one response that included success. So when we now hit save, let's run this one again, and fingers crossed, monitoring response. And here we see our log, which comes from the actual Playwright test case that gives us this response body telling us, hey, here was this successful response body, and it includes the name Zhang Wei. And I hope I pronounced that correctly. Apologies if I didn't. So with that, we can now clean up a little bit. We can remove our logging over here. And when we look at our checklist, we waited for the correct request and response URLs over here. We checked for the correct response. We did that over here. And because we are now returning a promise that resolves to true, we now are also able to return the correct response object. But we are not doing anything with the returned response yet. So let's go back into our test case. Here we have the returned response and already parsed response body. And now we can adjust our web first assertion that uses this heading locator, which currently really matches any heading. We can go in here and we can define the accessible name property. And when we give this a string like my name over here, it will check if this heading has the accessible name includes my name. To debug this, we can now open up the Playwright UI. And when we go in here and we run this test case, which is ours, let me close these two. We already see that this one is waiting, even though something is shown, because now this locator is expecting my name to be in the page, but it is not. So what we now can go into our test case and we can say that the name property of this locator should be equal to the response body. And we're not after status, but after name. So when we now go back to the Playwright UI mode, we can hit this one up again. So let me do this. And we already see that this now passed. And when we look at this assertion, it is expecting that this headline includes the name Pooja, and it is successfully working out. And when we look at the network layer, we see that there were multiple API calls. Everything is working as we expected it to. So here we have it. If your test cases must wait for particular responses, you can always use Playwright's wait for response method that accepts a string or regular expression if you only want to wait for one response. But if you care about the response bodies and the results of your API calls, you can always pass in a function and then return true for the response that you care about. But always remember, with dealing Playwright, it's always recommended to test UI first. So make sure to not overuse network monitoring or waiting for responses, because this could lead to flakiness in some scenarios. But for cases like ours here, where frontend is making the same API calls over and over again and is displaying something that is included in the response body, I think it's totally valid to reach into the network to check if the UI is rendering the correct data. And this was this week's Playwright tip. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below. And always remember, if you're using Playwright for end-to-end testing, you might want to check out Checkly and use your Playwright testing for global monitoring too. And with that, I will talk to you very, very soon again.